In 1628, a 9-year-old boy was led into a courtroom in Würzburg, Germany. He wasn't there to testify. He was there to confess. Within 3 days, he had named 14 adults. Within a week, he was dead. His execution was recorded in official documents. His name was added to lists that stretched across pages. And then the process simply continued. What happened in Europe between 1560 and 1660 killed tens of thousands of people. But the killing was never the point. Something else was being built, step by step, case by case, body by body. A machine that didn't need fuel, a machine that didn't need belief, a machine that only needed repetition. By the time it stopped, entire towns had been emptied, families had been erased, and everyone left standing had learned the same lesson: stay quiet, stay invisible, and never ever stand out. This is the story of what that machine actually did. Not the folklore version, not the simplified version you learned in school, the documented version. Every subscription helps us recover one more erased voice. The one with names, dates, and procedures recorded in court archives that still exist today, and why it works so well that parts of it are still running today. The witch hunts are often placed in the medieval period, in the Dark Ages, in a time of ignorance and superstition before enlightenment arrived. That's completely wrong. They happened later, between roughly 1560 and 1660, during what Europe called the Renaissance and the Reformation, an age of printing presses, universities, international trade, and expanding literacy. Martin Luther posted his thesis in 1517. The Malus Maleficarum was printed in 1486. The most intense witch hunts happened in the 1600s. These events overlapped. The same society that produced Galileo, Shakespeare, and the scientific method was also burning people alive in town squares. This wasn't a contradiction, it was a feature. Underneath the cultural progress, Europe was coming apart. The Protestant Reformation had split Christianity into competing factions. Catholic and Protestant territories now fought for survival, legitimacy, and control. The 30 Years' War, which lasted from 1618 to 1648, would eventually kill approximately 8 million people. That's roughly 20% of the population in affected regions. Plague outbreaks returned in waves. The Black Death never fully disappeared. Smaller epidemics swept through towns every few years. Harvests failed repeatedly. The period between 1560 and 1660 included what historians now call the Little Ice Age. Decades of colder temperatures that shortened growing seasons and devastated crops. Governments were fragile. Borders shifted constantly. Local authorities competed with regional powers. Kings fought with nobles. Everyone fought with everyone else. And in the middle of all this chaos, ordinary people were trying to survive. When things went wrong, and things went wrong constantly, people asked why. Why did the crops fail? Why did the children die? Why did the neighbors turn violent? Why did everything feel like it was falling apart? The answer couldn't be random chance. It couldn't be bad weather, disease, or political instability. Those explanations were too impersonal, too uncontrollable, too overwhelming. People needed a cause they could identify, and they needed someone to blame. The devil, not as metaphor, not as symbol, not as distant the theological concept, as an active present force working through human agents to destroy Christian society from within. This belief was nearly universal. Protestants and Catholics disagreed on almost everything: worship practices, church authority, salvation, the nature of faith itself. But they agreed on this: Satan was real, his servants were real, and they lived among ordinary people disguised as neighbors working to bring about the end of the world. When crops failed, it wasn't weather. When children died, it wasn't disease. When communities fractured, it wasn't politics. Someone had made it happen, and that someone lived nearby. Certain people attracted suspicion more than others. The pattern was remarkably consistent across different regions. Widows without family support, women who lived alone after their husbands died, had no male protection and little economic security. They were vulnerable and visible. healers who used herbs and charms. Folk medicine had existed for centuries, but now these practices were reinterpreted as demonic. Midwives present when births went wrong. Infant and maternal mortality rates were extremely high. When tragedy occurred, the person present became the explanation. People who argued with neighbors, a dispute over property, livestock, or debts could linger for years. When misfortune followed, the argument was remembered. People who didn't attend church regularly. In a time of religious warfare, irregular attendance signaled something. People who were simply disliked. Sometimes there was no clear reason, just years of accumulated resentment, envy, or discomfort. Once someone was named, they became the explanation for everything that had gone wrong. The failed harvest 3 years ago, she must have cursed the fields. The livestock that died last winter, he made a pact. The stillborn child. She was there when it happened. Fear didn't require evidence, it required a name. In that year, 2 German inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Springer, published a book, Malus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches. It wasn't the first text on witchcraft. Books about magic, demons, and evil had existed for centuries, but this one was different. It was systematic, organized, procedural. It explained how witchcraft worked, how witches operated, how they were recruited by the devil, how to identify them, how to question them, and most importantly, how to justify what came next. The book was printed across Europe, translated into multiple languages, distributed to courts, churches, and legal authorities. Between 1486 and 1600, it went through 28 editions. It became a reference manual, and it normalized a process. The Mallas made several key arguments. First, witchcraft was real, organized, and widespread. This wasn't folklore, it was an actual conspiracy. Second, witches operated in secret. They hid among ordinary people. They appeared normal. This meant anyone could be a witch. Third, witches would always deny their activities. Denial was expected. Therefore, denial was not evidence of innocence, it was evidence of deception. Fourth, physical evidence could be found on the body. Marks, scars, or areas insensitive to pain indicated a pact with the devil. Fifth, confession was the goal. Everything in the process was designed to produce confession. This logic created a closed system. Accusation triggered investigation. Investigation always found something. The accused always denied it. Denial proved guilt. Interrogation produced confession. There was no exit. Once the Mallas established the framework, courts across Europe began following similar procedures. The process had distinct steps. Step 1. Accusation. Someone makes a claim. A neighbor reports strange occurrences. A relative mentions suspicious behavior. Sometimes a child repeats something they heard. The accusation doesn't require proof. Suspicion is sufficient to begin proceedings. Step 2. Arrest. The accused is removed from their home, U.S. usually without warning, often at night. They're taken to a cell, separated from family and community. This isolation serves multiple purposes. It prevents them from fleeing. It prevents others from helping them. It signals to the community that the authorities have taken action, and it begins the process of breaking down the accused's sense of reality. Step 3. Examination. The body is searched for marks, moles, scars, birthmarks. Any irregularity becomes potential evidence of a devil's mark, proof of a pact. Sometimes areas of the body were pricked with needles. If the accused didn't react either because of natural insensitivity or because fear had numbed them, this was recorded as proof. The examination was often conducted publicly or semi-publicly. The humiliation was intentional. Step 4. Interrogation. The accused is questioned. Sometimes physical pain is applied. Techniques varied by region but included thumbscrews, strapardo, hanging by bound arms, leg vices, and stretching racks. But pain wasn't always necessary. Exhaustion was often more effective. Sleep deprivation, days without rest, constant questioning, disorientation, loss of time, hallucinations. The accused would be woken every few hours, questioned, then returned to the cell, then woken again. After several days, most people couldn't think clearly. But here's the critical part. The interrogators didn't wait for the accused to invent a story. They supplied one. You flew through the air at night. You attended a gathering in the forest. You met the devil there. He appeared as a man dressed in black. You signed a pact with him. You renounced God. These weren't questions. They were statements. The accused, exhausted and terrified, eventually repeated these details back. Sometimes, word for word, this was recorded as confession. A confession didn't end the case, it expanded it. Because after the accused confessed to their own activities, the interrogators always asked the same final question. Who else was there? Who else attended the gathering? Who else made a pact? Every name led to another arrest. Every arrest led to another interrogation. Every interrogation produced more names. The system fed itself. The process worked because it was consistent. The same steps were followed in village courts and city tribunals, in Catholic territories and Protestant regions, in wealthy areas and poor ones. Everyone knew what would happen once someone was accused. And that knowledge changed behavior. People stopped defending their neighbors because defending someone accused of witchcraft made you suspect. People stopped questioning the authorities because questioning the process made you suspect. People learned to stay quiet because silence was the only safe position. The Prince Bishop of Würzburg, Philip Adolphberg, oversaw one of the most intense witch hunts in European history. In just 5 years, at least 900 people were executed in his territory. The accused included people from every level of society, children as young as 7 years old, university students, priests, city councilors, the vice-chancellor of the university, relatives of the judges overseeing the trials. A document from 1629 lists 29 executions carried out in a single batch. Among those names, a girl of 9 or 10 years, a boy of 12, the prettiest girl in Würzburg, a student who knew many languages, a wandering boy of 12. Another list from the same period includes Goebbels' child, the prettiest girl in town, a boy of 10 who went to school, 2 strange boys. Age offered no protection, education offered no protection, social status offered no protection. The process consumed whoever was named. There was another dimension to what happened in Würzburg. When someone was convicted of witchcraft, their property was seized. The costs of the trial, the imprisonment, the interrogation, the execution were charged to the accused's estate. If they owned land, it was taken. If they had savings, it was confiscated. If they had possessions, they were sold. In some cases, the families of the executed were left with nothing. In other cases, the families themselves were accused next. This created an economic incentive structure. Trials generated revenue. Confessions produced more trials. More trials generated more revenue. The machine became self-sustaining. 60 miles away, Prince Bishop Jan Georg II Fuchs von Dornheim pursued his own campaign. He built a specialized facility, the Drudenhaus, the witch house. It was designed specifically for processing witch trials. Interrogation chambers, holding cells, administrative rooms where confessions were recorded, and property transfers were documented. Approximately 600 people were executed in Bamberg during this period. Among them, Johannes Anunius. He was the mayor of Bamberg, a respected official, a man of education and standing. In 1628, he was accused of witchcraft. During his imprisonment, Junius managed to smuggle a letter to his daughter, Veronica. The letter still exists. In it, he described what happened during his interrogation. He was shown the instruments. He was told what would happen if he didn't confess. He insisted he was innocent. They applied the thumbscrews, then the leg vices. He still maintained his innocence. They used strapper to hanging him by his arms tied behind his back. He screamed that he would confess to anything. They took him down and gave him time to remember. Then they asked him questions. Where did you meet the devil? What did he look like? What did he promise you? Who else was there? He gave them the answers they wanted. He described a meeting in the forest. He described the devil as a man in dark clothing. He named other people. All of it was invented under torture. He ended the letter to his daughter. They say I have confessed. That is true, but how I came to confess, good God in heaven knows. They have taken me through so much that I know not whether I am alive or dead. Now, dear child, you have here all my acts and confession for which I must die. It is all falsehood and invention, so help me God. He was burned alive 3 days after writing that letter. What happened in Würzburg and Bamberg happened in dozens of other locations. Trier, approximately 368 executions between 1581 and 1593. Ellwangen, approximately 430 executions between 1611 and 1618. The Basque region, approximately 7,000 investigated, though most were not executed due to skeptical inquisitors. Scotland, approximately 4,000 executions between 1560 and 1707. The specific numbers varied, the legal procedures varied, the intensity varied, but the core process remained the same. Accusation, isolation, interrogation, confession, execution, new accusations. The executions were public events. They took place in town squares or designated execution grounds. They were attended by crowds, sometimes hundreds of people. The condemned were often transported in carts through the streets before reaching the execution site. The method varied by region. Burning at the stake was common in German territories. Hanging was more common in England and Scotland. Some regions used both, hanging first, then burning the body. The executions could last hours. They were designed to be witnessed. The audience wasn't there to mourn. They were there to watch. They were there to learn. That accusation was more dangerous than guilt. That defending someone made you suspect. That the process was more powerful than innocence. That asking questions was riz. Kai. That survival required silence. The executions taught everyone watching how to behave, and that lesson was reinforced every time the process repeated. The witch hunts didn't continue because everyone believed in witchcraft. They continued because the system had become self-justifying. Each execution proved that witches existed. Each confession proved that the interrogation methods worked. Each new accusation proved that the threat was ongoing. The machine produced its own evidence. Courts could point to confessions as proof. Officials could point to executions as results. Communities could point to the next accusation as justification. Questioning the system required admitting that previous executions might have been wrong, and that admission never came. Confession was the centerpiece of the entire process. Without confession, the system became vulnerable to doubt. But with confession, everything was justified. The accused had admitted their guilt in their own words, often in front of witnesses. The fact that the confession was produced through torture, exhaustion, and supplied narrative didn't matter in the official record. What mattered was that it existed. The process spread through documentation. Court records from one trial were referenced in others. Manuals like the Mallas were copied and distributed. Legal scholars wrote treatises on how to handle witchcraft cases. Officials who had conducted trials in one region moved to another and brought their methods with them. The system became standardized not through central planning, but through repetition and imitation. One of the most disturbing developments was the use of child testimony. Children were considered particularly vulnerable to demonic influence, but they were also considered less likely to lie, at least initially. In some cases, children's accusations triggered mass trials. In Sweden, in 1668, a series of accusations by children led to approximately 300 people being accused in the village of Mora. Around 85 were executed in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692. Accusations by young girls triggered the infamous Salem witch trials. Children were questioned about what they had seen. They were asked leading questions. They were praised when they provided the right answers. They learned what adults wanted to hear. And then they said it. The system began to collapse when it reached too far. When mayors, priests, judges, and nobles started appearing on execution lists, other officials took notice. The process had become indiscriminate. If status and education offered no protection, then no one was safe. Courts began requiring more evidence. Confessions obtained under torture were quietly discredited. Legal procedures changed. Standards tightened. The machinery slowed. By 1650, the most intense period was over. But the change didn't come from sudden compassion. It came from self-preservation. Estimates vary, but historians generally agree on a range. Between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed. For witchcraft, in Europe between 1560 and 1660. Some estimates go higher, some go lower. Records were inconsistent or lost, but the general scale is clear. Tens of thousands dead. Approximately 75 to 80% were women. Most were over the age of 50. Many lived alone. Almost all were economically vulnerable. For everyone who died, thousands more watched. They watched their neighbors arrested. They watched the trials proceed. They watched the executions. And they adjusted their behavior accordingly. They learned to avoid conflict. They learned to attend church regularly. They learned to keep their opinions private. They learned not to stand out. The machine killed tens of thousands. But it controlled millions. Beyond the direct deaths, entire communities were damaged. Trust between neighbors evaporated. Social bonds fractured. Knowledge held by healers and midwives was lost or suppressed. The fear of accusation changed how people interacted. They became careful. They became suspicious. They became silent. That silence lasted long after the trials ended. Today, thousands of documents from which trials still exist in European archives. Court records, confessions, execution lists, property seizures, administrative correspondence. These documents show the bureaucratic nature of what happened. The process was recorded. The steps were documented. The outcomes were filed. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't mob violence. It was administration. The witch hunts are often described as mass hysteria or company. Lective delusion. But hysteria is chaotic and unpredictable. This was organized and consistent. The same procedures were followed across different regions, different legal systems, different religious denominations. The same questions were asked, the same confessions were produced, the same outcomes occurred. The system didn't hunt witches. It manufactured confessions. It redistributed property. It enforced conformity. It demonstrated power. It trained an entire society to fear accusation more than injustice. The European witch hunts killed tens of thousands of people over a 100 red-year period. But the executions were the smallest part of what happened. What the system actually did was create a template for how to control populations through fear of accusation, a template for how to extract confessions that justify predetermined outcomes, a template for how to make process more important than truth. That template didn't disappear when the witch hunts ended. The same structures were used later. The same logic was applied elsewhere. The same procedures were refined and repeated. Different targets, different justifications, different names, same machine. The witch hunts ended in Europe by the late 1600s. But the system they built never stopped running. It just changed what it was hunting. The histories that disturb us most are the ones that show us what we're still capable of. Every subscription helps us keep digging into the parts most stories leave.